two symbolic apologies were given a week apart at the end of October 1992. Emperor Akihito of Japan visited China, the first Japanese emperor to do so, and expressed sorrow for the atrocities committed there under the reign of his father Hirohito, now known post-reign as the Emperor Showa. And Pope John Paul II apologised for the prosecution and persecution of Galileo Galilei in 1633. While the latter wasn't exactly a hot-button issue, there was some hope that he was testing the water for more salient issues such as those brought up by Sinead O'Connor just a few weeks earlier. Shortly after the Australian Grand Prix, Alexander Dubćek was killed in a traffic accident in Prague. Dubćek had risen to power in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and championed a programme of cultural and economic liberalisation that he called socialism with a human face. He oversaw the decision to split the country into a federation of two states, the Czech and Slovak Socialist Republics, but his liberalisation and democratic reforms, known as the Prague Spring, ended in bloodshed as the Red Army, supported by troops from Poland, Bulgaria and Hungary, invaded the country to topple Dubćek and restore central communist authority in the country, though the federalisation of Czechoslovakia did remain in force. Dubćek, himself a Slovakian, died just 2 months before the breakup of Czechoslovakia was made official, and many had expected him to return to power as the first president of independent Slovakia. And the US presidential election saw Bill Clinton defeat the incumbent George Bush in a decisive manner, registering 370 electoral votes to 168, and winning the popular vote by 43% to 37%, with third candidate Ross Perot polling nearly 20 million votes, 19% of the total, the best done by a third candidate since 1912, but not winning a single state. The 1992 election was something of a political realignment in the US, with the Northeast and West Coast going heavily Democratic, and 22 states which had voted for Bush in 1988 now switching to the Democrats. Later analysis suggested that the comparatively major turnaround was due to a combination of Bush being seen as a war leader from the Cold and Gulf Wars, but having overseen recession and gone back on his famous no new taxes pledge from 1988, while Clinton was a centrist candidate acceptable to almost all of the usually fractious Democrats, as well as having a youthful and exuberant public image. And so to Australia, where the gang assembled for the last Grand Prix of 1992 admitted feeling that an era was ending. Nigel Mansell was retiring, Ayrton Senna's future was uncertain. There was apparently an offer on the table from Roger Penske, and a Brazilian super team of Senna and Emerson Fittipaldi going up against the reigning F1 champion would definitely be of interest to many who might not otherwise bother with IndyCar. Fellow veterans Martin Brundle and Thierry Boutsen still had no seats confirmed. Riccardo Patrese was ending his 5-year association with Williams, having finally turned down their offer to stay. Honda ending their 9-year-long involvement as an engine supplier. Lee Gorg of Goodyear announced his retirement too after 12 years at the head of the Ohio firm's F1 department. He was scathing of the decision to impose 15-inch rear tyres for 1993 and called the drivers collectively overpaid spoiled children, but Marlboro threw him a farewell party with Mansell and Senna both in attendance. Two men staying in the sport meanwhile were tearing their hair out in frustration, what little of it they had left in the case of Ron Dennis. The McLaren boss, having failed to buy Ligier, now hinted that his team would be willing to ditch their lucrative contract with Shell if that was what it took to get their hands on those ELF-fueled Renault V10s, but it seemed unlikely. Renault's new golden boy Alain Prost was known to be opposed to the idea, and Williams were liable to be a lot cagier about sharing technical info with Renault if they were also powering the competition. And besides, everyone remembered the toxic Prost-Senna rivalry as teammates, and the Renault execs just didn't want to get into the middle of that. So it was looking very much like McLaren would have to settle for the customer version of the Ford HB V8 in 1993, which in turn probably meant Ayrton Senna would not be driving. That in turn was making Bernie Ecclestone tear his hair out. He'd seen the TV figures, and with them potential advertising revenue, fall off a cliff with the boring early season domination of Nigel Mansell and Williams, but now faced the spectre of two of the sports superstars leaving in a huff, and an even more one-sided cruise to the title for Prost in 1993. Bernie even travelled to the US to see if he could buy Mansell's contract out from Carl Haas. Sure, just give me $12 million down was the answer. though what he would then do with Mansell's contract was anyone's guess. The ongoing wrangle over fuel formulas was going nowhere, and despite Lee Gogg's complaints, Goodyear seemed to have managed to produce tyres for next year that were somehow even quicker while being smaller, and just to put the tin hat on things, the French Grand Prix was now threatened. The regional court in Quimper, Brittany, known to be very strict about French laws on tobacco advertising, had issued a fine of $35 million to the Williams team following the race in Manicourt. The French Evin law that regulated tobacco advertising contained a grandfather clause allowing those manufacturers already in the sport in 1976 to continue for the time being. That meant Philip Morris, Marlboro, and Sater, Gitane, were fine, but Reynolds, Camel, had arrived in 1987, so they were banned. Williams threatened not to go to France in 1993 if they were going to be slapped with a fine as soon as they landed. Max Mosley told Jean-Marie Balestre, still head of FISA, that if Williams didn't go, the race would be cancelled, and to use his political connections to sort it out. Interestingly, the only source I found for this doesn't mention Benetton, who were also running Camel logos in France, so whether that's an omission by the source or the court would make an example of Williams, I don't know. The proposed Asian Grand Prix at Autopolis was definitely off, as it turned out that some of the circuit owners were connected with the Yakuza. This in itself wouldn't necessarily bother Bernie based on past experience, but the Japanese authorities said they would sequester any revenue from the race pending trial, so that was a non-starter. At least Flavio Briatore got their $10 million for having their logo on his car for 2 years. The race in Adelaide didn't look too secure either. Not only was it losing money hand over fist after 2 washouts in the previous 3 years, currently running a deficit of $30 million dues, but also the race was the passion project of Labour Prime Minister John Bannon, and the Liberal Party was now back in power and looking to undo whatever he'd done. For this year at least, the organisers had resurfaced the track to improve drainage after last year's chaos. There was a lot of hair-tearing to go around. Gerard Larrousse was also having trouble. Having had one business partner jailed for murder, he now discovered that another, Rainer Waldorf, president of the Comstock firm which was buying out Venturi's stake, was actually Klaus Waltz, wanted by Interpol for 4 particularly nasty murders across 2 countries. Officers arrived at Waltz's house the week before the race to arrest him, only for him to produce a hand grenade, threaten to blow the lot of them up, handcuff the policemen to their car, and run off with their guns. About a month later, he was tracked down to a hotel in Gelsenkirchen and killed after a 9-hour shootout with the German police. There was one possible spot of good news, though. There was a late proposal for a new F1 team for 1993, with a Catalan group fronted by Jaume Magranci Perello calling itself Bravo F1, planning to buy the assets of the Andrea Moda team as the basis of a Barcelona-based team with former driver Adrian Campos involved, and possibly pairing Thierry Boutsen with Spanish F3 driver Jorge Gené, who'd impressed at Macau in 1991. Anyway, back to the present as the cars took to the track for the first qualifying session on Friday, and the track slowed considerably on Saturday, so just as in Japan, it was mostly the first session that determined the grid. In imperious form, Nigel Mansell took his 14th pole of 16 races by just under half a second from Ayrton Senna, whose McLaren Honda in its last outing was really suited to a circuit needing lots of torque and traction. Riccardo Patrese was third after struggling with understeer, and Berger fourth with a mysterious power loss. The twitchy Benetton struggled to get set up, Schumacher fifth after going backwards into a wall, and Brundle eighth, while Alesi was back on form in sixth, and De Cesaris was a season's best 7th as he celebrated his contract renewal with Tyrrell. Guillaume might have done better than 13th too if he found a clear lap. Comas was 9th, the Lotai unhappy in 10th and 12th either side of Alboreto in his last outing for footwork. Modena had a decent qualifying for Jordan in 15th, Boutsen was all the way back in 22nd for what could be his swan song after breaking a shock absorber, and the Larrousse boys heaped misery on misery, with Katayama, unfamiliar with the track, last of all. Going into the race, it was still a 3-way battle for second place in the table, with Patrese 6 points ahead of Senna and some 9 ahead of Schumacher. The German would need to win, with his future teammate not scoring, but anything was possible. Likewise, there were just 8 points between McLaren and Benetton in the constructors' race, so for all that the focus of both British and Australian media was on this being Nigel Mansell's last race in Formula 1, there was still plenty going on elsewhere on the grid. Sunday saw dark clouds overhead, but with a stiff breeze blowing them out to sea, it didn't look like there would be a repeat of 1989 and 91, and there were 100,000 packed into the stands, which would go some way towards balancing the books. Australian Channel 9 put together a fun little montage of thrills and spills from previous races in Adelaide.
Look at that!
And then it was time to go for the last race of the year. Larrousse managed to stall on the grid for the second time in as many races, this time as they got away for the parade lap, and he would have to start from the back. Off they went, Mansell and Senna blasting down to turn 1 together, with Prix challenging, while Berger bogged down and dropped behind Schumacher and Alexander. As they streamed around the first chicane complex, Gugelmin nudged Guiar's Tyrrell, which skewed round and hit Martini's Dallara, then clipped Herbert's front wing. Martini's race was over, and Guiar, a chunk of Dallara front wing stuck under his own, didn't go much further. Alboreto had also damaged his rear suspension, which broke a few corners later, snapping him into a spin and retirement. As the rest continued around lap 1, 2 pairs had already emerged, with Senna tucked up on Mansell's gearbox and Schumacher hassling Prix. Berger got past Alesi as they came down the Brabham Straight, but all eyes were on Senna, who flung himself past Mansell into the Duquetteville hairpin, only to run wide and lose the place straight away. If this really was the last time we'd see Mansell and Senna on track together, at least we were getting a great race out of it. So, with Senna all over the back of Mansell like a cheap suit, the leading pair were pulling away from now three-way scrap between Prix, Schumacher and Berger, who used his Honda V12 power, in its last race, to overhaul the V8 engine Benetton on lap 3. Behind the top 6, Häkkinen and Cesaris were also having a ding-dong scrap. The Finn got ahead at the end of the Brabham Straight, but ran slightly wide on the exit for the corner and got tipped into a spin by the Tyrrell. He kept it moving, but with everyone still running close together, he dropped right back to 22nd, just as Herbert was being released from the pits dead last after losing 2 laps getting his nose fixed. A lot of work for Lotus to do if they wanted to overtake Ferrari, but the gap was only 3 points and there was a long way to go yet. Herbert was in fact being lapped for the 3rd time by Mansell and Senna as they traded fastest laps, though Mansell had managed to give himself a little breathing space, and the Prix-Berger scrap followed past Johnny shortly afterwards. Gugelmin's Jordan career came to an end, courtesy of a brake failure at the end of the Brabham Straight, sending him into the wall unharmed but shaken, and out came the yellow flags at one of the track's prime overtaking points while the debris was cleared, which would stymie attempts by the 2 McLaren drivers to get past their respective Williamses. On lap 11, Mansell broke the lap record that he'd set himself in a Ferrari in 1990, as the yellows came in and Berger got back to attacking mode, and Häkkinen, unseen, was moving up the order, passing Katayama, Lammers and Aspetti. The order by now was Mansell leading Senna by about 1.5 seconds, with Prix a rather distant 12.3 seconds behind his team leader, with Berger still hot on his wheels, and Schumacher still with them in 5th. Brundle was running 6th, about 5 seconds behind his team leader in what could yet be his last Grand Prix, certainly his last one for Benetton, with a comfortable 10 seconds behind him, then De Cesaris 8th, and Modena and Morbidelli making up the top 10, which was all covered by a little under 46 seconds. Berger was really going at Prix, having a go every lap at the end of the Brabham Straight, while Mansell and Senna were approaching a knot of backmarkers, Larrousse first up. As Mansell negotiated his way through, Senna closed right up, and on lap 19 as they went into the last turn, Mansell braked a little early and Senna went straight into the back of him, shedding his front left wheel and sending both cars onto the runoff area and out of the race. Perhaps it was the only way the Senna-Mansell rivalry could have ended, but both drivers were absolutely furious about it, heading into the pits to go their separate ways, Senna on the first plane to Sao Paulo, and Mansell to the nearest available golf course, via the physio, as he'd felt he'd jarred his back badly in the incident. So the hugely entertaining scrap between Prix and Berger was now elevated to one for the lead, with Schumacher hoping for the pair to emulate their teammates. Berger certainly emulated Senna's move on lap 1, braking super late into the hairpin to take the lead only to run wide and lose it again. There were at this point now 9 different constructors in the top 10 places, with Prix, Williams, Berger, McLaren, Schumacher and Brundle, Benetton, Alesi, Ferrari, De Cesaris, Tyrrell, Modena, Jordan, Morbidelli, Minardi, Boutsen, Ligier and Suzuki footwork. Schumacher lost some time in getting past Naspetti, which allowed the leading pair to get away a bit, while Häkkinen had by now moved up to 11th, which became 10th when De Cesaris' Ilmor engine detonated on lap 30, also promoting Stefano Modena into the points in his Jordan Yamaha. Prix and Berger continued going at it hammer and tongs as half-distance approached, until on lap 35 of 81 the Austrian peeled in for new tyres, entirely missed by the TV director until he reappeared behind Schumacher in 3rd place. Prix had a lead now of about 4 seconds over the Benetton, with Berger another 10 seconds or so behind, but both Schumacher and Berger were absolutely flying, and the top 3 were closing back up again, assisted by Häkkinen, whose pursuit of Aguri Suzuki meant that he was holding up Prix. He was an equal opportunities roadblock and also held up his old F3 rival Schumacher, who gave him a fist wave as Brundle pitted from 4th on the halfway lap. When Schumacher was held up in his turn by Suzuki too, Berger closed right up, getting past Häkkinen. In fact, the footwork could really shift and Schumacher was having trouble closing up with it, and before he managed, Berger pounced, retaking second as Schumacher in turn went in for tyres, re-emerging still 3rd but now some 20 seconds behind Berger. Berger on fresh rubber was charging and was now just 7.5 seconds behind Prix and gaining every lap. If Ricciardo changed tyres as well, Berger would have the lead. Morbidelli had a spin and got going again in 10th, having lost places to Suzuki and Häkkinen, and round about then the weather seemed to be turning. The clouds had been clearing for the first half of the race, but now it began spitting. Not enough to affect grip, but if it started raining properly, that would really set the cat among the pigeons. Berger was still going, setting a series of lap records as he continued reeling in Prix, while Schumacher was also in hot pursuit of the McLaren too. And then on lap 51, Prix was pulling over, his fuel pump having given up the ghost, and Berger blasted through into the lead. So with Senna and Prix both out, if something happened to Berger and Schumacher won, he would after all take 2nd place in the championship. But first he had to get past Häkkinen again, who was again reluctant to let him through. So the order with 30 laps to go was now Berger leading Schumacher by about 20 seconds, with Brundle 3rd, Alesi 4th, Boutsen 5th and lapped, Modena 6th, Suzuki 7th, Häkkinen 8th, Morbidelli 9th and Fittipaldi 10th, the two Minardis running close together. There was rain visible on the lens of Brundle's onboard camera now, but the strong wind was blowing the clouds over quickly, so it was still uncertain whether it would get wet enough to need a change of tyres. As yet it wasn't affecting anything as Berger broke the lap record again, and indeed it shortly stopped. Berger and Schumacher's lap times were very close together, although the cars were some way apart on the track, as Berger lapped Alesi, running a lonely 4th, and indeed Schumacher now turned up the wick, breaking the lap record himself and starting to reel Berger in as the Austrian ticked off the laps to the end. But Berger had a problem. He'd been racing so hard that his dashboard was now telling him he needed to dial right back or he'd run out of fuel. And now, suddenly, with just 13 laps to go, Schumacher was taking lumps out of his lead. On lap 70, Berger was passing a knot of back markers, Fittipaldi getting past Morbidelli in the middle of the track, and by the time Berger was through, Schumacher was now just 9 seconds behind with 10 laps to go and gaining at nearly a second a lap. The German had to make his own way through the traffic, of course, but Berger was unable to get away again while he did so. With 6 laps to go and the traffic out of the way, Berger came up to Aguri Suzuki, running 8th and still getting a shift on, and with the McLaren's engine set to economy mode, he took some time getting past, allowing Schumacher to close up further. 4 laps to go, a 7-second gap. Schumacher had no problem getting past Suzuki, and as they went into lap 80, 2 to go, he had it down to 6.1 seconds. It did look like that wouldn't be enough after all as he threw it around the circuit, but Berger remained calm and in control. Schumacher began the last lap just over 5 seconds in arrears, but Berger was running on fumes now, and his pursuer was gaining hand over fist. He nearly did it, catching Berger as they went into the last corner and crossing the line just 0.741 seconds behind. Martin Brundle came in third, his 5th podium of the season, with a lazy 4th to take 3 more points for Ferrari, and in 5th and 6th were Thierry Boutsen and Stefano Modena, both taking their first points of the season. In Thierry's case, his first and probably last points for Ligier after 2 frustrating years, and in Modena's the only point of the season for Jordan. Hakkinen was 7th, then Suzuki, the Minardis and the ailing trio of Nicola Larini, active suspension problems, Jan Lammers, no gearbox, and Johnny Herbert, never recovered from losing 3 laps at the start. And that was 1992. Gerhard Berger's win meant that Patrese hung on to second in the championship, but Michael Schumacher's second place meant that he would finish his first full season of F1 in third, ahead of the great Ayrton Senna, while Berger could take some satisfaction in not only driving a great last race for McLaren, but finishing the year only 1 point behind his illustrious team leader. Benetton's double podium meant that they had scored points in every race of the season, the first time a team had done that since Lotus in 1963, a 10-race season, but couldn't overhaul McLaren, while a lazy 3 points for Ferrari couldn't prevent the prancing horse having its lowest points tally since 1980. It had been an exciting race despite the premature end to the big Senna and Mansell showdown everyone had been looking forward to, and had provided something of a tonic after what had at times been a rather processional season of Williams' dominance. With Mansell, Berger, Patrese and Brundle all moving on, Prost returning and big question marks over Senna, Hakkinen and many others further down the pit lane, 1993 would have a very different look to it.